You know, some people move to the countryside for peace and quiet. Chickens clucking, cows mooing, the occasional ghost in the attic, real simple living. But in 1920s, Bavaria, nestled among silent forests and snow-dusted fields, one family farm was about to become a murder mystery so strange, so goosebump-inducing, that even the cows probably side-eyed the haystack. Welcome to Hinterkaifeck, where the milk was fresh, the neighbors were nosy, and death was uncomfortably punctual. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know who else is up late listening to true crime with the lights off. Or, just slightly dimmed for effect. Let's step into the snow now. Shall we just... Don't follow any footprints, especially not the ones that stop mid-path. As the year 1922 clawed its way through a grim German winter, the Gruber-Gabriel family, Andreas, Victoria, little Kazilia, baby Joseph, Victoria's elderly parents, and a chicken coop that knew too much were busy doing what farming families do, surviving. Their homestead, a half-mile walk through deep forest trails, was isolated even by rural Bavarian standards. No direct road, no phone line, just one narrow path through a copse of spruce trees and the occasional awkward Sunday visit from their kind of friend but mostly judgy neighbors. Hinterkaifeck wasn't even its real name. That was a nickname. Technically, it wasn't even a registered village, just a few buildings scattered behind the town of Kaifeck. Hence, Hinterkaifeck. Think of it as the rural equivalent of that creepy house by the edge of town. You know the one, a chassé. Now, let's be honest. The Grubers weren't exactly beloved. Andreas Gruber, the family patriarch, was known to be a surly old goat with a history of, shall we say, unfortunate hobbies. His daughter Victoria had secrets so dark they could have filled a confessional booth twice. But for the most part, life on the farm trudged forward in a haze of daily chores, stern looks, and bread that could break a window, until something or someone started walking through the snow. It was March when Andreas noticed the first set of footprints. They came from the woods, not to the house and back, just to the house, which is weird enough, unless your mailman wears invisibility cloaks. And then there were the noises, footsteps above the ceiling when everyone was downstairs, missing keys, a newspaper in the house that nobody remembered bringing in. At first, Andreas did what any good grumpy farmer would do. He told no one and muttered about kids these days. But it wasn't just him. His wife, Victoria, and even their young daughter Cecilia began to feel uneasy. Doors left open, whispers at night, the horses in the stable growing jumpy for no reason, the cat refusing to go upstairs. Okay, the cat part's speculative but statistically probable. Now, this might sound like the setup to a haunted house flick, and honestly, it kind of is. Except instead of spooky poltergeists, it was something far more human and far more dangerous. You'd think someone would call the police. You'd be wrong. It was 1922 in rural Germany. If your neighbor showed up wearing half a goat and declaring himself Kaiser Wilhelm, you'd probably just offer him tea and keep your concerns to yourself. But here's a true historical fact to spice things up at this exact time in history. Bavaria was still reeling from the political chaos after World War I. The Weimar Republic was a mess. Inflation was a joke. And most rural families were more worried about feeding their pigs than tracking phantom visitors. This was a country on edge, and Hinterkaifeck, apparently, was just catching up. By the end of March, something strange had settled over the farm. The animals were restless, the old maid had quit, the family seemed withdrawn, and in the town of Grobern, just a few kilometers away, neighbors began noticing that nobody from Hinterkaifeck had been seen in days. The last time anyone recalled speaking to the family was March 31st, after that radio silence, which is always a bad sign, especially when there's still smoke rising from the chimney. It's worth noting that some of these details were later debated by amateur sleuths and criminal psychologists alike. Were the family paranoid? Were they hiding something? Was it all just misremembered shadows and small-town gossip with a sinister flair? Those are the kinds of questions that keep forums buzzing and midnight podcasts humming. And sure, maybe Andreas was imagining things. Maybe he dropped the newspaper himself. Maybe footprints in the snow don't mean anything. But then again, maybe someone was already inside. Either way, the story had begun, one snowy footprint at a time. Oh, and here's your quirky fact of the day. Bavarian cows in the early 20th century were often trained to respond to specific songs sung by their owners. So when investigators later found the animals had been fed and milked after the murders, well, someone had been singing lullabies to livestock after committing one of the strangest crimes in European history. You're starting to feel weird about farms now, aren't you? Good, let's keep going. If you've ever had that sensation of someone watching you when no one's there, congratulations. You might have made a fine resident at Hinterkaifeck. For the Gruber-Gabriel family, that feeling wasn't fleeting. It lingered, like smoke in the rafters or a creepy houseguest who refuses to leave. Every creak in the hallway, every gust of wind against the shutters, began to take on new meaning. The family wasn't just spooked, they were quietly spiraling into fear. Let's pause here for a moment to consider the setting. The house itself was a big, rambling farmhouse with thick stone walls and a layout that was part home, part barn, and part borderline labyrinth. Not exactly cozy. And with no electricity and only oil lamps for light, nighttime was a special kind of pitch black. You could barely see your own thoughts. It didn't help that the house had an attic. Because, of course, it did. From time to time, someone in the family, usually Andreas or Victoria, would mention hearing scraping or shuffling sounds from above. Sometimes it was footsteps, like boots dragging across the floorboards. Once, Victoria said she heard whispering, though she couldn't make out any words. Not that anyone believed her. Victoria was complicated. We'll get there. Andreas, proud to a fault and notoriously distrustful of authorities, still refused to call the police. He told neighbors that something was off at the house, but didn't elaborate. Probably because he figured the townspeople already thought he was a few bricks short of a chimney. But not everyone in the house was silent about their fear. The maid, for one. Her name was Crescentia, and she was not about to stick around and get haunted. She'd been with the family for a few months, and to her credit, she tried to be reasonable. That is, until she heard footsteps overhead when everyone was downstairs and saw a figure moving through the stable in the dead of night. She packed her bags the next morning. "I'm sorry," she told Victoria, "but this house is cursed." That's a direct quote. By the way, as direct as we can get from 1920s, Bavaria filtered through decades of oral retelling, police files, and spooky campfire summaries. Crescentia would later tell investigators she believed the house was haunted not metaphorically. She meant actual spirits. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she wasn't. True historical fact. In post-WWI Germany, especially in rural Catholic regions like Bavaria, belief in the supernatural was widespread. Ghost stories weren't told for entertainment. They were often accepted as explanations for real-world events. Some people even saw them as warnings, which is a weird way to say get out of the house, but hey, whatever works. The thing is, her departure didn't solve anything. The noises continued. Doors that were locked one night were found open the next morning. The barn tools were moved. A ring of keys vanished. Victoria thought she was losing her mind. Little Casilia, barely old enough to spell poltergeist, said she saw someone in her room, but everyone chalked it up to nightmares. At one point, Andreas found a set of boot prints that led from the forest to the house, but no prints leading back. And because this was Bavaria in early spring, the snow made a perfect canvas. They were clearly human, clearly recent, and clearly not his. And still he didn't call the police. Modern criminologists point to this behavior as escalating situational normalization. Basically, If something weird happens often enough, you stop thinking it's weird. You start adapting. You make tea while the ghost stomps overhead. You feed the chickens while your tools disappear. You rationalize everything until you can't. Meanwhile, Victoria had secrets of her own, like the fact that she may or may not have been in a taboo relationship with her father. Yep, you read that right. According to court records and village gossip, which, to be fair, was basically the same thing back then, Victoria and Andreas had once been convicted of incest, a serious crime in 1915 Germany. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. Baby Joseph, Victoria's son, was officially fatherless. Andreas claimed the child was his. Victoria claimed it was her late husband's. A man who, by the way, had supposedly died in World War I, but according to one theory, might have faked his death and returned for revenge. Or maybe he just went to get cigarettes and got lost in the trenches. Quirky side detail, there was a traveling salesman who used to pass by Hinterkaifeck and swore he once overheard Victoria arguing with a man inside the barn. A man no one else had seen. That salesman also noted that the family seemed tense and that the barn smelled weird. But he was selling sausage grinders, so his expertise is debatable. Let's not forget the cows. In the weeks before the murder, the animals began behaving erratically. Horses refusing to enter stalls, dogs barking at empty corners. A local vet would later say the animals had abnormal stress patterns, which sounds like something you'd say when you're trying really hard not to admit that ghosts are real. Philosophers and armchair psychologists still debate the significance of the family's passive descent into dread. Was it denial, fear, pride, or just good old-fashioned Bavarian stubbornness? Either way, things were sliding toward disaster like a hay bale down an icy hill. And then, something shifted. Andreas finally told a neighbor he believed someone was living in the house. Not visiting, not breaking in, living there. Which begs the obvious question, where? The attic, one of the locked storage rooms. The barn's hayloft. The house was large, shadowy, and cold. There were plenty of nooks where someone could hunker down, especially someone quiet and patient. And here's a bonus fact. Many of the homes built in that region and era had hollow walls or false crawl spaces perfect for hiding out. If you don't mind rats and seasonal existential dread. So at this point, let's take inventory. We've got a family hearing noises and finding footprints, a maid quitting after a paranormal encounter, a father who won't call for help, a daughter with a secret past, a possibly illegitimate child, and cows having nervous breakdowns. All set in a house where something might be upstairs. If this were a movie, we'd be yelling at the screen, "Get out, leave the farm, take the cows, and go." But no one left. Instead, they went to bed. And when they woke up, it was March 31st, the last day anyone would see them alive. Morning came to Hinterkaifeck the way it always did, quiet, frostbitten, and about 2 hours too early for anyone's liking. A rooster somewhere choked out its complaint. The cows shuffled in their stalls, waiting to be milked. The world, outside and in, pretended everything was normal. Inside the house, though, the atmosphere had gone brittle. That morning, Andreas Gruber was already irritated, which wasn't unusual. He rose early, as always, and stomped around the house with his usual scowl. Victoria, his daughter, was silent, staring into her tea like it had just told her a terrible secret. Little Casilia kept her eyes down, refusing to eat. The maid, a fresh new hire named Maria Baumgartner, was trying not to breathe too loudly. Let's talk about Maria for a second. Maria had just arrived the day before March 30th. She was older, in her 40s, and had taken the job out of desperation more than enthusiasm. When she was picked up at the train station, she was reportedly cheerful. That didn't last. Within hours of arriving at the farm, she'd written a letter home to her sister, stating simply that the place felt wrong. True historical detail. That letter was later found in her suitcase, unopened, unsent. She never made it to a second day. Anyway, back to the kitchen. The tension was soup thick. Victoria was visibly shaken, her eyes bloodshot. She hadn't slept. Neither had Andreas, though that may have been more due to rage than fear. No one talked about the noises the night before, the creaking upstairs, the muffled bump. They just sipped tea and scraped their plates in silence. Baby Joseph gurgled in his crib, blissfully unaware that someone or something might have been watching the family for days, or weeks, possibly even longer, and now that watcher was ready, mid-morning. Victoria went out to the barn. It could have been to feed the animals, to fetch something, or maybe she heard a noise. Whatever it was. She left the house and never came back. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Andreas followed next, maybe to check on her, or maybe just to yell at her in his usual affectionate dad-style full-volume scolding. Then silence again. Young Cecilia, ever curious, stepped outside. Gone. Then the grandmother. Gone. The barn, like many built in that region and time, had a large central area for the animals and storage, with dark corners and plenty of hay. It was connected to the main house via a covered walkway. Anyone or anything could have hidden there for days without being noticed. Maybe longer. The working theory. Each person was drawn in one by one. Whoever the killer was, they were patient, calculated, cold. Not just in temperament, but in method. They didn't run. They didn't chase. They waited, and when each victim entered, they were struck down, possibly with a mattock, a heavy, sharp-edged farm tool similar to a pickaxe. Imagine something that could till soil or open a skull, and you're in the right ballpark. This wasn't a frenzied murder. It was surgical, precise. 4 bodies fell in the barn, each separated by minutes, not moments. That's part of what still puzzles criminologists today. How did no one scream? How did no one run? Even forensics teams decades later noted the lack of drag marks or signs of struggle. That's either terrifyingly efficient killing or something even more disturbing. Something like familiarity or trust. Remember, this was a family full of secrets. Some modern theorists believe the killer wasn't just known to them, but accepted, invited, even. Which opens the door to a darker possibility that the monster inside Hinterkaifeck was already part of the story, long before the bloodshed began. But we're not done. Back inside the house, little Joseph slept in his crib. Maria the maid was in her room, unpacking her things. She may have heard the sounds outside. She may not have. All we know is what investigators found later: 2 more bodies. Maria was killed in her bed, struck down quickly. Maybe while sleeping or turning toward a sound. No signs of defense, no scream. Joseph, too, was found murdered in his crib. A toddler, left alone in the silence of the house while the killer moved from room to room. It's a hard moment in the story. Even for the most hardened true crime fans, the death of a child feels like a line that shouldn't be crossed. But here we are. The line was obliterated with a farming tool. Now here's your quirky detail. The Grubers had a dog. A big one. A German Shepherd. One of those dogs that could knock over a fully grown man if it felt like it. It was kept in the barn, and neighbors reported hearing it bark for days after the murders. But not during. No frantic barking, no warning, no howling, just silence. And then, days of whimpering. Philosophers of criminal behavior love this case for how it breaks all the patterns. It's not just brutal, it's intimately brutal. No signs of robbery, no vandalism, no message left behind. The killer or killers didn't seem to want anything. They just did it, then stayed. Because here's the weirdest part. The murders likely happened sometime in the early afternoon of March 31st, but the bodies weren't discovered until April 4th. In between, smoke was seen coming from the chimney. Animals were fed. Cows were milked. Meals were eaten. Someone was living in the house. That detail has haunted investigators for over a century. Whoever killed the Grubers didn't just strike and flee. They made themselves at home, tended the livestock, slept in their beds, possibly even cooked their food, a sort of post-homicide house-sitting. But creepier. And so, as night fell on March 31st, a strange silence settled over Hinterkaifeck. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that holds its breath. The cows were milked. The dog was fed. The stove was lit each morning. From the outside, life at Hinterkaifeck seemed eerily routine. But the people inside were already dead. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it's one of those facts that yanks you sideways in your chair. Someone, presumably the killer, stayed. For days. Not hours. Days. Inside the house. With the bodies. Feeding the animals. Using the fireplace. Sleeping. Reading the paper. Maybe wearing Andreas's socks. It wasn't until April 4th that anyone in the surrounding village thought to knock. You'd think people would be quicker to notice an entire family ghosting them. But rural life moves differently. The neighbors had seen smoke from the chimney and assumed all was well. Plus, the Grubers weren't exactly the social butterflies of the area. Andreas was known to be difficult, which is polite German for he made milk curdle just by glaring at it. But eventually, small things stacked up. Victoria missed choir practice. Little Kazelia wasn't in school. Packages went uncollected. The mailman mentioned the mailbox was oddly full, and then there was the food order. A local grocer had received a request from Hinterkaifeck, but when they delivered it, no one answered the door. Odd. But again, rural Germany. People sometimes just didn't answer the door for reasons ranging from "I'm milking a goat" to "I don't like your face." Finally, it was the mechanic who broke the deadlock. Andreas had scheduled a repair on a farm machine. The mechanic showed up, knocked, waited, knocked again. He heard the dog barking in the barn, but no one came. Curious. He peered through the slats. The animals were fed, watered, and unnervingly calm. Too calm. The mechanic left. But when he got back to town, he told the neighbors something was off. The next day, a small search party was assembled, a local farmer named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and 2 other neighbors. Now I'd remember Lorenz. He's going to come up again. And again. And again. They arrived at the farm mid-morning. Silence. Just wind and birdsong. They knocked. Nothing. The door was unlocked. So they entered the barn. It's hard to say what the smell was like by then. Some mix of hay, livestock, and other things. The barn floor was uneven, with heaps of straw piled around. That's where they found the first body. Then another. Then another. 4 bodies, all half buried in straw, laid out almost ceremoniously. And then, panic. Schlittenbauer bolted to the house while the others stood stunned. Inside, he found more the maid and the toddler. All dead. Here's where things get questionable. Because Lorenz Schlittenbauer did something weird. According to witness accounts, he began moving the bodies. This was before the police were called. Why he claimed it was so the victims could be laid out respectfully. Others think he might have been trying to cover something. Still others say he was just in shock and acting on reflex. Which, to be fair, would be a decent explanation if he hadn't also opened drawers and checked closets like someone looking for their keys. And then there's this. Lorenz had once had a relationship with Victoria. Yup. Town gossip said he believed he might be Joseph's father. They'd even discussed marriage, supposedly, before it all went sour. Victoria moved back in with her parents, and Joseph's paternity remained a foggy mystery. So now we have the former maybe boyfriend of the murder victim, discovering the bodies, moving them, and poking around the house before the authorities even arrive. Suspicious. Very. But we're not done yet. The police finally show up from Munich a full day later. Because in 1922, murder wasn't considered a top-tier emergency unless it happened in the city. And once they arrived, they did what 1920s police were really, really good at accidentally destroying the crime scene. Officers tramped through the barn. Locals wandered in and out like it was a crime-themed open house. Kids climbed the ladder to the hayloft. People touched things, moved things. One guy reportedly took a souvenir. Yes, a souvenir from a murder scene. In fairness, there wasn't much entertainment in 1922. No fingerprints were taken. No photos. The killer's trail, if there was one, was already going cold. In a tragic twist of irony, the stove had been recently used. Perhaps to cook meals, or, as some speculate, to burn evidence. And now here's your true historical fact. In 1922, Germany's forensic science was in its infancy. Blood typing was known, but rarely used. Crime scene preservation was a suggestion, not a protocol. And unless someone left a full written confession, most murders in the countryside were solved by gossip or dumb luck. Meanwhile, the dog, faithful as ever, was still there, guarding the property, clearly traumatized. It had a deep cut on one eye. Some speculated it had been struck but not killed. Perhaps by the murderer. Perhaps as a warning. Perhaps because it barked at the wrong moment. The cows, eerily, were still calm. Fed. Cared for. Someone had been inside, looking after them. And that someone was now gone. Quirky fact: investigators found the family's food stores had been partially depleted. Bread was missing. Some canned goods had been opened. A set of footprints led away from the house to the edge of the woods before vanishing entirely. The case was officially opened, and immediately stalled. Theories flew fast and loose. A vengeful ex-lover, a wandering madman, someone from the war with a grudge, or, as one imaginative local suggested, a ghost from the woods. Yes, that's right, a literal ghost. Because according to local legend, the woods behind Kaifeck had long been considered strange. Stories of lights, shapes, whispers. A place you didn't walk through alone. Not unless you wanted to come out changed, or not come out at all. Philosophers who analyze collective fear point to the way communities construct mythology to process horror. When the facts are too awful, people wrap them in story. A ghost in the woods is easier than a killer in your own village, but no one could deny the facts. 6 people were dead. The killer had stayed, lingered, even cared for the animals, and then disappeared into the trees. No tracks, no witnesses, no motive, just silence and straw. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the sheer weirdness of what the police found. 6 dead. No signs of forced entry. No clear motive. A killer who, let's recap, had stuck around, milked the cows, kept the fires going, and possibly made themselves a nice stew while surrounded by corpses. It's less a murder case, and more a folk horror Airbnb from the 9th circle of hell. But it was about to get weirder. Once the authorities from Munich stopped stepping all over the evidence, like a conga line in muddy boots, they decided to get scientific. That meant exhumations, autopsies, and skull removals. Yes, skull removals. See, the pathologist at the time was one Dr. Johann Baptist Aumiller, who believed the key to solving the case lay in cranial trauma patterns. So, naturally, he chopped off the victims' heads and sent them to Munich for examination. True fact, this wasn't uncommon in early 20th century Europe. In certain murder cases, the heads were sent separately for forensic analysis, usually in tin boxes or glass jars, depending on your budget and your tolerance for nightmares. Dr. Aumiller determined that all 6 victims had been killed with blunt force trauma, consistent with a mattock or pickaxe-like tool. The blows were delivered with disturbing accuracy. Victoria, for example, had been struck multiple times, one of which crushed her skull entirely. Her young daughter, Cecilia, had torn clumps of her own hair out, possibly in panic before she died. The maid, Maria, had been hit once, square in the forehead. Joseph, just 2 years old, had been covered with his mother's dress and killed with a blow to the head. Efficient, deliberate, no hesitation. One police report said the killer showed signs of planning, knowledge of the farm, and emotional detachment. In other words, they weren't just passing through. They knew the layout. They knew the people. And they didn't flinch. Meanwhile, the skull's now decapitated curiosities in a Munich lab went missing during World War II. No one knows where they ended up. Possibly destroyed in bombing raids. Possibly tossed in an evidence archive. Possibly hanging in someone's creepy den next to a cuckoo clock and a mounted boar. Back at Hinterkaifeck, the investigation stalled. Detectives were sent door to door, but leads dried up faster than beer at Oktoberfest. Hundreds of people were interviewed, from farmhands to drifters to shady ex-military types. Every male in the area was considered a suspect at some point. But then, just when things were beginning to fade into the usual haze of small-town tragedy, someone remembered something. The barn door had been unlocked, and not just after the murder. Always. It was a well-known detail among locals that the Grubers rarely locked up, which made investigators wonder had the killer been watching Waiting Living nearby. Which brings us, naturally, to our next suspects, everyone in the village. Suspicion fell fast and ugly. Accusations were thrown around like Oktoberfest pretzels. Old grudges resurfaced. A baker with a criminal record became a prime suspect for a week. A traveling handyman was arrested, questioned, released. One man, reportedly a mute vagrant, was so thoroughly beaten by locals that police had to step in not to protect him, but to stop him from dying before they could question him. And all of it led nowhere. So what do you do when real-world logic fails? You turn to superstition. Locals started whispering about curses, that Hinterkaifeck had always been tainted ground. Some older villagers claimed the land had once belonged to a man who vanished mysteriously in the late 1800s. Others said there had been a fire there long ago, and that nothing had grown properly since. Quirky interlude. A self-declared clairvoyant chicken farmer from 2 villages over came forward, saying she had seen the murders in a dream and could point to the killer. She was, for a brief period, considered a legitimate witness. Spoiler, she was not. Still, her popularity reveals something important. Philosophers often note how communities process trauma through narrative. In the absence of justice, myth fills the void. The tale of Hinterkaifeck didn't stay confined to police records. It began to mutate. It became a story. And that story was about to get even more twisted, because now the focus turned inward to the family themselves. You remember Victoria, the daughter with the baby, no one could quite account for. Turns out her personal history was a mystery, all its own. Some villagers claimed she had a secret lover. Others insisted that Joseph's father was a local man who'd been pressured into denying paternity. Then there were those who swore Andreas Gruber was the real father, making Joseph not just his grandson, but his son. Yeah, it's that kind of story. To make matters worse, Victoria had withdrawn all her savings from the bank just a few weeks before the murder. The money was never found. Investigators theorized she may have been planning to flee with someone, or that someone killed her for the cash. Still others wondered if the murders weren't about any of that, but rather a personal vendetta. Andreas had enemies. Victoria had secrets. The maid had literally just arrived. Was she collateral damage, or was she a target? And what about the footprints in the snow? They were back on everyone's minds. There had only been one clear set leading to the house, not away. In other words, the killer arrived alone, but no tracks leading back out. That could mean the killer left before the next snowfall. Or it could mean, well, they never left. Cue the eerie violin music. Back to real-world facts. By mid-April 1922, the case had gone fully national. German newspapers dubbed it Das Mörderhaus, the Murder House. It was front-page news. People came from across the country to gawk, theorize, even hold vigils outside the gates, but no new evidence surfaced. No weapon was ever found. No confession. Just a farm, slowly rotting under the weight of silence. Eventually, the house was torn down, destroyed, flattened like the memory of a bad dream. Only a memorial cross was left behind. That's all that remains now. Well, that. And the story. The barn smelled like damp hay, and something far worse. The floor, a hard-packed mixture of soil and straw, still bore the dark stains from the murders. People said the smell lingered for weeks, even after the bodies were removed. The police tried to clean it up. Locals avoided walking too close. Dogs growled as they passed. Meanwhile, the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied. The case had gone cold within days. Not metaphorically cold. Cold, like a crime scene left out in a Bavarian winter. But the gossip that was red hot. And that's when theories began to bloom like fungi in the dark, each more absurd or compelling than the last. The most chilling moment in the early investigation came when someone asked a simple question. How was it possible that 4 people were lured into the barn, one by one, without anyone screaming or fleeing? The answer: the killer knew them, or was so terrifyingly strategic, so precise, that not a single scream got out. Think about it. Victoria walks into the barn. Silence. A quick blow to the head. Andreas follows, maybe annoyed she hasn't come back. Then the grandmother, then little Cecilia, all in near total silence. No cries, no signs of a struggle. Just the muffled thwack of a mattock meeting bone. It makes you wonder, was the killer hidden in the hayloft waiting, like a wolf among sheep, or were they standing in plain sight? Someone trusted enough that no one saw the blow coming. Modern criminal psychologists have wrestled with this detail for decades. Some believe it was a spree killing someone who snapped, but others lean toward premeditation, a patient, focused mind, possibly sociopathic. Possibly someone who'd rehearsed this moment over and over again. And then there's the kicker. The killer likely stayed for days afterward. That's not typical. Most murderers panic. They flee. They leave chaos in their wake and vanish into the mist like a bad Sherlock Holmes villain. But this one, they lingered. They milked the cows. They fed the dog. They cleaned the stables. They ate meals in the same house where 6 bodies lay dead. Let's be clear, this wasn't someone just crashing for the night. They were nesting. And here comes your historical fact in post-war Germany, especially during the early 1920s. There were thousands of homeless soldiers and war refugees wandering the countryside. Many had mental health issues, untreated trauma, or criminal records. Some communities believed that these desperate souls were capable of anything, so naturally, investigators turned to drifters as potential suspects. Every bearded man within a 100-mile radius suddenly became suspicious. One man was arrested because he had a limp and didn't make eye contact at the bakery, but no solid evidence ever surfaced. And then came the talisman theory. You see, while combing through the barn, one officer noticed something shiny tucked into the hay. It was a small medallion, possibly religious, with strange etching symbols that didn't match any Christian order in the region. A local priest was called in. He stared at it for a long time and said nothing, then pocketed it and left. Later, when pressed, he said, "There are some things that do not concern the living." Okay, Father Cryptic, thanks for that comforting insight. Some villagers began whispering that the killer had left a sign, a marker, not unlike ancient pagan symbols said to ward off spirits or attract them. Was it connected to the Gruber's past? A cult? A dark ritual? An inside joke among Satanists? The talisman vanished shortly after. Like a magician's coin. Poof, gone. Never logged as evidence. Never seen again. This is where the story starts veering into campfire territory. Because around this time, a theory took hold that the killer didn't just stay in the house. They had been living there all along, not just for days, for weeks. Remember the noises from the attic, the missing keys, the mysterious footprints in the snow leading to the house but not away. Add to that the accounts of neighbors who'd said weeks before the murders they saw a figure moving behind the attic window long before Maria the maid had even arrived. The attic, by the way, was never searched thoroughly. There was no ladder on site when police arrived, and no one seemed especially eager to climb up there and find out if a murderer was still hanging around, munching on sausage and reading Andreas's old letters. Quirky fact, the attic was constructed with a crawl space that connected above several rooms, including the barn, the kitchen, and even the baby's room, meaning someone could have moved through the house without ever being seen. Are we having fun yet? That possibility that someone had been in the house before the murders, watching the family, learning their habits, mapping their fears has become one of the most enduring theories of the case. A quiet intruder. A long con. In this theory, the killer wasn't a vengeful neighbor or a jealous ex. He was a shadow, a living ghost, a squatter with a plan. Philosophically speaking, it ties into a broader fear embedded deep in the human brain, the idea that you're not alone, that something is just out of sight, watching, waiting. You've probably seen movies riffing on this exact fear like The Strangers, Hush, or that one X-Files episode with the attic's goblin. They all tap into the same primal dread that someone could be in your house right now, and you'd have no idea. And that's why the tale of Hinterkaifeck keeps crawling back into the public imagination, because it's not just about murder, it's about violation, about something or someone invading the one place you're supposed to be safe. It's about how long a person or a monster can go unnoticed before they strike, and that time might already be up. By April 1922, the official investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders had already started to dissolve, like sugar in dark tea sweet on the surface, but quickly vanishing into murk. The press had moved on to other dramas. The local police were overwhelmed and understaffed. The people of Groburn and Kaifeck tried to go back to their lives, which mostly meant pretending not to look over their shoulders every time a twig snapped. But for the handful of investigators still poking at the case, one horrifying question refused to sit quietly. Why kill the baby? Joseph, just 2 years old, had posed no threat, no testimony, no screaming, no memory strong enough to haunt anyone. And yet, the killer made their way through the house and dealt a single, fatal blow to a sleeping toddler. No hesitation, no mercy. This, more than any other detail, is what convinced several criminologists even today that the murders weren't just about rage. They were about erasure, a full purge, like someone was trying to delete the Gruber-Gabriel family from the planet. And here's a fact that adds even more weight to the theory Maria. The maid had only arrived hours before the murder. She was unpacking her things, adjusting to her new room, and likely still wondering why everything smelled faintly of damp goat when she too was killed. Quickly, without warning. That means either the killer didn't know she was coming and decided, why not? Or they knew she was coming and planned around it. If that doesn't give you the shivers, please check your pulse. Maria's room had a window facing the back of the property. The curtains were drawn. The bed was partially made. Her suitcase had been opened, and a pair of shoes had been placed neatly beside it. One of the strangest things, no signs of a struggle. Nothing disturbed. No broken furniture. No overturned lamp. Just one clean blow to the head. A modern behavioral analyst would later describe it as clinical, which is a terrifying word to use when you're describing someone killing an innocent woman in her new job on her first day. But it fits. And now, the house was quiet. 6 dead. 6 days. No sign of the killer. But there were traces. A single set of fingerprints on the barn door latch. Too smudged to analyze. A small indentation in the hayloft dust, like someone had been laying there. Possibly for hours. Possibly longer. And the strangest one, a chunk of bread and sausage sitting on a plate in the kitchen, next to an empty milk bottle. The food wasn't old. It hadn't spoiled. It had likely been eaten the night after the murders. Again, the killers stayed. If the family hadn't already had their brains smashed in, They could have written an awkward Yelp review. 1 star. Too many rats. Creepy guy in attic. Did not appreciate the post-murder house guest. And here's your quirky detail. Someone had also used the family's wash basin. There was blood in the water and a scrap of cloth, as if the killer had cleaned themselves after the murders, which implies planning. They brought clean clothes. They expected to get messy. They made arrangements. This wasn't rage. This was a project. The idea that the killer remained in the house while the bodies cooled was disturbing enough. But when villagers began realizing that the animals had been cared for, it took on a new dimension. Imagine it, the killer, perhaps sitting in Andreas's chair, eating bread, staring at the fire, then getting up, milking the cows, shoveling hay, feeding the dog, which, by the way, had been tied up and injured, but not killed, a rare moment of mercy, or something more strategic. Maybe the dog knew the person and didn't bark. Or maybe it did, and that's why it was tied up and struck. This part of the case remains a source of debate among forensic psychologists. Could someone be methodical enough to clean themselves, care for animals, and sleep under the same roof as the people they had just slaughtered? Or here's the more bone-chilling angle: was it several people? There's a theory that floats in Hinterkaifeck circles, often dismissed as too cinematic, the kill team. In this version, multiple people coordinated the attack. One lured each victim to the barn. One waited in the shadows. Another cleaned up. A small group, maybe with military training, who knew how to move efficiently and without detection. Too complex, maybe. But then again, if this were a movie, you'd call it implausible. In real life, though people do strange things for stranger reasons. Here's another philosophical bite. Some criminologists argue that the best way to conceal a crime is to make it look completely senseless. No pattern, no purpose, just horror. That way. The investigation spins in every direction and never gains traction. Sound familiar? Every investigator who touched the case found themselves stuck in the same tangle. No robbery, no rape, no clear motive, just total annihilation. And yet, there was one more detail, one that made people lean in close and whisper. Even decades later, the killer made the beds. No joke. Inside the house, the beds had been straightened. Not perfectly. Not like your grandmother with military corners, but tidied. Not all of them. Just some. Maybe it was habit. Maybe guilt. Maybe a mockery. But picture this, after murdering a child and a woman he'd never met. The killer stood in the room and pulled the covers neatly across the mattress. That single act has baffled forensic profilers for years. Was it a psychological tic-a compulsion, a twisted attempt to restore order after chaos? Or, as one expert once put it, there's a darkness that doesn't explode. It just arranges things. That quote sticks with you, doesn't it? Because the deeper you go into Hinterkaifeck, the more the case feels less like a mystery, and more like a message. A quiet one, written in blood and hay, and strange, lingering silence. And speaking of silence, what about the neighbors? They were the last piece of the puzzle, and they were starting to look sideways at each other, because surely someone knew more than they were saying. And in the next part, we'll go door to door, theory by theory, and meet the rogues gallery of suspects who made this case even more twisted than you thought. When the neighbors finally stumbled across the bodies at Hinterkaifeck, they didn't just uncover a crime scene, they opened a Pandora's box of suspicion. You see, in a town as small as Grubern, people remember who borrowed sugar, who didn't return it, who got drunk at church and blamed the bishop, that sort of thing. And now, suddenly, the polite nods and half-smiles at the village bakery turned into squint-eyed speculation. Because if the killer wasn't some random drifter or a ghost in clogs, then it had to be someone local. And everyone had a theory. First to find himself at the sharp end of gossip was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who helped discover the bodies, and also helped himself to a bit of unsolicited corpse arranging, if you recall. Let's recap Lorenz real quick. Had a romantic history with Victoria, Thought baby Joseph might be his, entered the crime scene and moved bodies before police arrived. Showed an oddly calm demeanor, considering he was stepping over corpses like they were sacks of turnips. He also let himself into the house using a key no one could explain. When questioned, he claimed the key had been left out before, or maybe the family never locked the doors, which was partly true. Andreas wasn't big on locks unless you were trying to keep your daughter from seeing other men. But here's where it gets odd. When police began questioning Lorenz, he was eager. Too eager. He gave lengthy statements, often with minor inconsistencies. For example, he claimed he went to the barn and immediately felt something was wrong. Then later, he said he didn't see the bodies until his second trip inside. Then he claimed he was overcome by grief right after calmly feeding the chickens. The kicker, he sued multiple newspapers for defamation when they suggested he was a suspect. And then get this, he lost every case. Courts ruled that he couldn't prove he wasn't involved. Let that sink in. A German court in the 1920s basically said, "You might be the guy. You just can't prove you're not the guy." Still, no charges were filed. There wasn't enough evidence. And to be fair, Lorenz also lost a son not long before the murders, and was reportedly grieving in his own unsettling way. But the whispers never stopped. For the rest of his life, he was that guy from Hinterkaifeck, which has to be the worst title to carry to your grave. Next up on the suspect carousel was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly dead husband. Wait, supposedly? Yep, officially. Carl had died in World War I, but his body was never recovered. His name was listed, his unit accounted for, but no grave, no dog tags, no charred remains under a trench. So naturally, theories began to swirl. What if Carl hadn't died? What if he'd come back? Found his wife living with her father again? Saw a baby boy who may or may not have been his? What if he snapped? Far-fetched? Absolutely, but not entirely implausible. Because, and here's your true historical fact of the day, hundreds of German soldiers went missing during WWI, especially in the Eastern Front. Many were misidentified, presumed dead, or simply vanished into Russian camps. Some returned years later, broken, changed, unrecognizable. The idea that Carl came back, saw the situation, and decided to eliminate his former family with military precision. Stranger things have happened. Still, there was no concrete evidence, just a hole in the records and a lot of dramatic speculation. Now, if that's not enough, allow us to introduce the Beechler brothers, two farmhands who had previously worked at Hinterkaifeck and were known to hold grudges. One had allegedly argued with Andreas Gruber over wages. The other may or may not have made inappropriate comments about Victoria at the pub. They were questioned. They had alibis. Sort of. One claimed he was drunk at the time. The other said he was in another town. Witnesses contradicted them. Then other witnesses contradicted the contradictions. It was a mess. Police couldn't pin anything on them. But years later, one of the brothers was reportedly overheard, during a drinking session, saying something like, "That old Gruber got what he deserved." Maybe bravado, maybe a slip, maybe guilt. We'll never know. Another suspect came from left field, a man named Paul Muller, a possible serial killer who had committed axe murders in the United States around the same time. He vanished without a trace and was believed to have returned to Europe. This theory was championed by some modern American criminologists who noticed striking similarities between the Miller killings and Hinterkaifeck isolated rural homes. Entire families murdered, the use of a blunt farm tool, and no robbery. Sounds compelling. Until you remember that connecting two horrific crimes across continents is the kind of thing that makes Reddit threads explode, but rarely holds up in court. Still, eerie. One final theory deserves mention: the incest motive murder. A few townspeople believed Andreas Gruber had finally pushed his sick dynamic with Victoria too far, and that someone, possibly a former lover of hers or a disgusted relative, had decided to end it. In this theory, The killer wasn't psychotic. They were moral, twisted by rage. Yes, but acting out of a sense of justice. A biblical avenger with a mattock. It's the kind of theory that appeals to those who need the horror to have purpose. A neat narrative arc, but real life, as you may have noticed, doesn't always come with clean endings. Philosophers of justice and ethics sometimes point to Hinterkaifeck as a haunting example of moral ambiguity in criminal motive. Was it punishment, madness, revenge, or just pure, remorseless darkness? Everyone in town had a theory, a suspect, a suspicion they nursed in silence. Meanwhile, the farm sat empty. But not for long, because eventually, as it always does, life crept back in. They say nature abhors a vacuum, but Bavarian real estate agents apparently abhor an empty murder farm even more, because only a few months after the Hinterkaifeck murders, while the scent of tragedy still clung to the soil and the cows were probably developing PTSD, the land was sold. Just like that. A transaction. A piece of property. Changing hands. 6 murders and 1 missing head collection. Notwithstanding. The new owner, a local farmer, who shall remain unnamed here out of basic human decency, and because, honestly, he didn't last long. Not because someone killed him, relax, but because he couldn't take it. The weight of the place, the strange noises at night, the way the barn always seemed colder than it should be, even in summer. He eventually abandoned the property, which is understandable. Imagine trying to plant turnips in soil where 4 people were bludgeoned to death and a toddler died crying. Probably not ideal for crop yield. Still, for a brief period, the property had visitors, spectators. Really. People came from miles around just to see the house, to peer inside the barn where the bodies were found, to poke around the hayloft with long sticks, as if the killer might still be curled up there, waiting for round 2. It became a morbid tourist attraction. Not officially, of course, but quietly. The way people rubberneck at car crashes or tour Jack the Ripper's London. Death has a strange gravity, and Hinterkaifeck was practically radioactive with it. Some even picnicked on the grounds. You read that right, picnics, sandwiches, children playing tag next to the murder barn. Quirky historical fact. Early 20th century Europe had a weird relationship with public death sites. In France, entire families once picnicked outside prisons during executions. In Germany, murder tourism had long been a quiet subculture, especially when folklore, superstition, or juicy scandal was involved. And this one had all 3. Eventually, the authorities stepped in not to arrest anyone, but to demolish the farmhouse. In 1923, it was torn down, piece by piece. The foundations were raised, the barn dismantled, the attic, finally empty, saw light for the last time. Locals said the ground moaned when the last beam came down. Probably the wind, probably. All that remained was a small stone cross, placed as a memorial for the victims. It's still there today. If you go deep enough into the Bavarian woods, just past where the trail thins and the trees start to look like they've been watching you since birth, you'll find it. People leave flowers, candles, coins, sometimes notes. Usually things like rest in peace or justice will come. But one year, someone left a scrap of paper with just 1 sentence. I know what happened. It was never traced. Classic anonymous tip-style cryptic, unhelpful. And just enough to send an entire generation of armchair sleuths spiraling into a frenzy. Speaking of frenzy, let's talk about the aftermath. After the house was gone and the police were out of leads, the case went dormant, like a bear in winter. But it never quite died, because every few years, someone new would come along and dig it back up. In the 1950s, a retired detective claimed he had fresh information, but died of a stroke before he could share it. In the 70s, an amateur historian tried to reconstruct the crime scene from the original police drawings, only to discover that half the original documents were missing misfiled, lost, or conveniently disappeared. Conspiracy, maybe, or maybe just 1920s record-keeping, which was basically write things in a notebook and hope the goats don't eat it. In 1999, German criminology students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy reopened the case as a training exercise. They combed through every surviving piece of evidence, every sketch, every yellowed interview transcript. After months of work, they issued a formal statement. We believe the killer is known, and the name is in the case file, but they didn't publish it, because the suspect had living descendants, and German law protects the reputations of the dead if it might affect the living. Let that sink in. The name may be in the file. The students had a theory. They had motive, timeline, method. But you can't know, because it might offend someone's grandchildren. There's a philosophical weight to that decision. The balance between truth and consequence, justice versus privacy, and the eternal question, is it better to let a mystery sleep if its awakening causes more harm? A lot of people disagree. The internet, for one, is not about letting things go quietly. Online forums still light up with Hinterkaifeck threads. Theories range from reasonable Schlittenbauer did it to unhinged the family faked their deaths and moved to Argentina to open a sandwich shop. People analyze handwriting samples, compare skull fracture patterns. One guy even tried to recreate the sounds in the barn using a simulation and a raw ham hock. No, really. He wanted to see if the thwack of a mattock could be heard from the main house if the door was closed. His conclusion, probably not. That kind of obsession gives the case a strange second life. Like it's not just a story anymore, it's interactive folklore. People pass it down, pick it apart, share it over wine or while walking their dog, who absolutely refuses to go into the woods anymore. Thank you very much. And in the process, the story shifts. It stops being about who did it. It becomes about why we care. Hinterkaifeck is the perfect mystery. It's a closed circle with a door propped slightly open. It's brutal, baffling, and just real enough to keep your mind turning long after the candles burn out. And like all the best ghost stories, it ends where it began, with silence and one bloody footprint in the snow. By the time the 1930s rolled in, Hinterkaifeck had already become something larger than itself. No longer just a brutal murder case. It was folklore passed between generations like an inherited cough. Children dared each other to whisper the name at night. Teenagers sneaked into the forest to find the memorial cross. Old women crossed themselves when the tale came up, and old men just muttered. It was someone we knew. Had to be. And always. The air stayed thick with the most Bavarian of sentences, wir sprechen nicht darüber. We don't talk about it. Which, of course, only made people talk about it more. But despite the silence and superstition, the police hadn't entirely let the matter go. Occasionally, a new officer or district attorney would flip through the dusty files and think, I can solve this. Spoiler, none of them did. The problem wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the overabundance of absurdity. Take, for example, the forensic report on the barn, which helpfully noted that the hay covering the bodies had been carefully forked into place. As in, someone had taken the time to tidily bury the victims under neat heaps of straw. Not in a hurry. Not thrown around like you'd expect in a panic. But like someone who had time. Someone who wasn't afraid of being caught. This has fascinated criminologists for decades. Because as any experienced profiler will tell you, the way a body is handled says more than the act of murder itself. A quick, sloppy killing is often emotional. A reaction. But cleaning up afterward, that's cold. That's calculated. That's someone who didn't just plan the crime. They planned the aftermath. Let's look at that word, aftermath. Originally from Middle English, meaning a second mowing, it implies a return, a circling back, which is, philosophically, exactly what Hinterkaifeck is, a story that loops in on itself, over and over again. But let's come back down to dirt and hay. The kitchen was just as strange as the barn. The stove had been used, a meal half prepared, a chair slightly out of place, as though someone had sat in it and stood up mid-thought. Most chilling, the clock had been wound. Yes, a wall clock. One of those old pendulum beasts that needed manual winding every 24 hours. Someone had wound it. Probably more than once. After the murders. This was a killer who wasn't just surviving, he was keeping time. Now, if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, maybe this will. Several villagers reported seeing smoke from the chimney at least twice in the days following the murder, meaning whoever did this didn't just stay one night. They hung around, ate meals, tended animals, slept, possibly sang a lullaby or two to the cows, and they did it all in total silence, even when neighbors knocked, even when a mechanic arrived to repair the feeding machine. Even when the dog barked for hours, the killer never revealed themselves. No window twitch, no flickering candle, just the eerie stillness of a house being lived in by no one and someone, all at once. All at. It was, quite literally, the performance of a ghost. And then there was the attic. You remember the attic, the one with the unsearched crawl spaces and years of unsettling noises. Well, eventually, a few brave souls did go up there, long after the murders, long after the place was abandoned. One said he found a depression in the dust, like someone had been lying down. Another claimed to have seen scratches on the beams, deep ones, like nails, or claws. He left the attic and refused to return. Something was up there, he said. It didn't want to leave. Of course, that's what everyone says when they spook themselves. But still, one of the strangest details from the crime scene remains mostly unmentioned in casual retellings, but it's worth dragging into the light. The killer stole nothing. Not the money Victoria had withdrawn from the bank, not the family's jewelry, not even the silverware, which was surprisingly decent for rural Bavaria. In fact, nothing in the house was disturbed, beyond the people. This, more than anything, killed the robbery gone wrong theory. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about things. It was about the family. But why? Why this family? Why this method? Let's revisit Victoria. She'd been the one spotted most frequently in town, attended church, sang in the choir, helped raise her daughter. And yet, her personal life was a Gordian knot of scandal. Andreas Gruber, her father, was known to be controlling, angry, and allegedly more than just a father. The incestuous history between them wasn't speculation. It was in the public record. They'd been convicted in 1915, both imprisoned briefly. And yet, when Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, died in the war, she returned to live at the farm with her father, and had a child, whose paternity remains a mystery to this day. Did someone finally decide that enough was enough? Did they believe they were righteous? Or was it simpler than that, just old-world cruelty, where secrets rot until something snaps? And while we're digging into psychology, let's take a moment to talk about the philosophy of the hidden guest. There's a concept in German horror folklore called der Untermensch, the beneath person, someone who exists in the hidden corners of your life. Not always malicious. Sometimes just there, waiting. The Hinterkaifeck killer has become the modern mythic embodiment of that archetype. The invisible man in the rafters, the eyes behind the wooden slats, the being who knows your schedule, your route to the barn, your habits. Not because he's psychic, because he's been watching, and that's what makes this case more than murder, more than a whodunit. It's a story about invasion, about the fear that someone could crawl inside your life, fit themselves to its shape, and wait for the moment to make it all disappear. No wonder the villagers stopped using the name Hinterkaifeck. No wonder they tore the house down. It's hard to keep living next to a place that reminds you, sometimes, evil doesn't break in. It moves in. By the mid-20th century, Hinterkaifeck had quietly taken on the personality of a cursed word. Locals no longer spoke of it unless prompted. Kids were warned not to stray near the cross in the woods. And if you asked someone about the murders at a local tavern, you'd get one of two responses: an uncomfortable shrug or an extremely long, extremely personal theory. that somehow involved a retired blacksmith and an owl. But the story refused to die, especially because none of the suspects, not one, made any real sense. Let's start with the obvious. There were just too many of them. Over the years, police compiled a list of over 100 suspects. Some were named in tips. Others volunteered themselves, which, frankly, raises its own questions. And a few were basically just unlucky guys with unusual faces. One of the early suspects was a man named Carl S., a local laborer with a criminal record, a drinking problem, and what his neighbors described as a bad smell and worse attitude. His alibi was thin, his behavior cagey, and he had once been heard muttering about those Grubers and their sins. Promising, not really. Because while Carl was odd, he was also terminally lazy. The kind of man who would struggle to kill a spider, let alone 6 people and then clean up after himself. Investigators agreed Carl couldn't have pulled off the timing, logistics, or effort. He was ruled out. Then came the gypsy caravan theory. Yes, that's what they called it. It was the 1920s. People blamed everything from bad crops to missing socks on passing travelers. The idea was that a group of vagrants had stumbled upon the farm, committed a robbery turned homicide, and fled. Except again, nothing was stolen. No one heard wagons. No caravan was ever found. And the biggest hole: the utter precision of the killings. 1 blow per victim, in most cases. Not chaotic. Not messy. Not something you'd expect from a panicked gang of roaming murder nomads. Next, the farmhand revenge plot. A handful of former workers were considered. Some had been fired by Andreas Gruber for alleged theft. Others had been caught slacking, which, under Andreas's management style, probably meant they had stopped working for 5 seconds to breathe. But again, police hit a wall. No one had motive and opportunity and the ice-cold nerve to execute a multi-stage ambush and then hang around to feed the livestock. Then we hit a truly bizarre suspect, Victoria's ghost husband. No, seriously. Some insisted Carl Gabriel hadn't died in the war, that he'd survived, gone into hiding, then returned to find his wife with a new baby and her father still lording over the household. The theory goes that he snapped, killed them all, and wait for it, disappeared again into the mist. Modern researchers did try to track down Carl's fate. They combed military records, interviewed surviving veterans, and found no proof that Carl had returned. Though, fun fact, there was a man in Alsace in the 1930s who claimed to have served with Carl and said he didn't die. He went somewhere else. Some say Argentina, because apparently everybody in Unsolved Mysteries flees to Argentina. And then, because no grisly rural case would be complete without it, we get the occult theory. Yes, occult. The idea that the murders were part of a ritual. That the killer wasn't just a person, but a participant. Maybe even a priest of something long forgotten. Or just someone dabbling in things better left untouched. What fueled this idea? Well, partly the eerie, symbolic way the bodies were arranged, and partly the odd talisman found in the barn. Remember that one. The small metallic charm with no known origin that vanished from evidence almost immediately. Throw in the fact that some locals reported seeing strange lights in the woods days before the murders, and you've got yourself a full-blown folk horror movie. Still, no firm evidence, just campfire-ready creepiness. Let's switch gears and talk scientific theories for a second. You'll like this. In 2007, a German criminologist named Andreas Koper, yes, another Andreas, because there can never be enough, attempted a full modern behavioral profile of the killer, using known data points, timing, weapon, sequence of events, and the post-murder behavior. He concluded the killer was male, over 35, familiar with the farm, likely lived within walking distance, highly organized, possibly ex-military, emotionally detached or psychopathic. But here's where it gets wild. He also noted the killer may have had a background in animal care, because of how well the livestock were handled. The milking was done properly. The animals were calm, not injured. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to maintain cover. They genuinely seemed to care for the animals. Quirky aside, one investigator suggested the killer may have been sleeping in the hayloft before the murders and developed a strange caretaker complex toward the farm, which, to be clear, is terrifying. Imagine someone lurking in your attic for weeks, observing your family, gradually seeing themselves as part of your world, and then deciding you had to go, like a toxic roommate who's been watching you from behind the drywall. Even decades later, new names kept surfacing. A man named Anton G., who allegedly confessed to the murders on his deathbed, only for his relatives to say he'd always been a little dramatic, and was also heavily medicated at the time. Another suspect, Joseph B., a traveling tinsmith, reportedly tried to sell jewelry that looked suspiciously like Victoria's. When questioned, he claimed he found it near some barn. Conveniently vague. Still, none of these leads ever brought the case close to resolution. And that's the curse of Hinterkaifeck, isn't it? Too many possibilities, too few facts. There's something almost taunting about it. Like the killer planned for the chaos that would follow. Like they wanted the story to tangle and twist forever. And in that twisted web, one person remains at the center. Someone we've mentioned before. Someone we're going to look at again, closely, in the next part. Because while many names have passed through the rumor mill of Hinterkaifeck, one man's shadow has always loomed just a little longer than the rest. And his name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. If Hinterkaifeck had a supporting actor with suspiciously star billing, it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, neighbor, widower, maybe ex-boyfriend, maybe ex-father-in-law, and possibly the weirdest funeral crasher in German history. From the beginning, Lorenz's connection to the Gruber-Gabriel family was tangled tighter than a hay bale in a hurricane. Years before the murders, he and Victoria had a relationship intimate enough that when Victoria gave birth to baby Joseph, Lorenz publicly acknowledged paternity. Briefly. Then he kind of unacknowledged it, claimed the child might be Andreas's, or Carl Gabriel's, or God's will, depending on what mood he was in. He even paid child support for a short while, then stopped, citing paternity confusion and ongoing weirdness at that farm. Fair, but here's where the Lorenz timeline gets itchy. On April 4th, 1922, when neighbors began to worry about the silence from Hinterkaifeck, Lorenz was one of the first to volunteer to check in. Noble, maybe. Convenient, certainly. He arrives with 2 other men, walks through the barn, and bam, 4 bodies in the hay. You'd think he'd scream, call the authorities, fall to his knees in horrified disbelief. Instead, he starts moving the bodies. According to multiple witness statements, Lorenz not only disturbed the crime scene, he rearranged it. He even untangled Victoria and little Kazilia's corpses and looked under their clothes. Why? He said he was checking to make sure no one was alive. Okay, but then why search their clothes? Then he wandered into the house, reportedly unshaken, and discovered the remaining bodies, Maria and baby Joseph, again. No visible distress, just quiet observation. Not cold, exactly, just weirdly calm, like he was walking through someone else's chore list. Then, according to one account, he fed the dog. Philosophers might call this behavioral incongruity. Normal people call it creepy. His explanations got even more suspect. When asked how he got into the locked house, Lorenz claimed he had a key. Why did he have a key? Victoria gave it to me, he said, but Victoria was dead. No one could confirm that story. And Lorenz had no proof. The key had gone missing from the house weeks before the murders. Later, when questioned about why he entered the property without waiting for police, Lorenz claimed he feared for the family's safety. But investigators noted that he didn't bring a weapon, didn't knock, and didn't even call out their names, almost like he knew they weren't going to answer. And remember, the dog didn't attack him. That's a big deal. That dog had been injured, possibly struck by the killer, but did not bark at Lorenz. Did that mean the dog recognized him? Or was it just relieved to see a human who wasn't actively murdering people? Here's a quirky twist. Lorenz later sued several newspapers for publishing stories implying he was the killer. And as mentioned before, he lost. The court essentially ruled that because the investigation remained open and no other suspect had stronger evidence, accusations against him weren't legally defamatory. In other words, we're not saying you did it, but also we can't say you didn't. Yikes. Over the years, Lorenz's behavior remained strange. At one point, he returned to the crime scene with a group of curious onlookers and reenacted how he'd discovered the bodies. That's right, he gave a murder tour, and not a reluctant one. By most accounts, he narrated it with enthusiasm, walked people through the barn, described the positions of the corpses, showed where he'd stood, even mimed the movements. According to one witness, it was like he was giving a stage performance. Let's remember this is a guy whose potential son, former lover, and maybe in-laws had all been brutally murdered in this space. At best, the man had the emotional range of a toaster. At worst, well, let's lay out the case for Lorenz being the killer. Knew the family intimately, had motive paternity, rejection, jealousy, had access, claimed to have a key, entered the scene and contaminated evidence, showed no shock at the deaths, dog didn't bark at him, sued for defamation and lost, gave casual murder tours like it was Bavarian Disneyland. Now, let's play devil's advocate. The case against Lorenz? No direct evidence. No murder weapon found. Behavior could be attributed to shock or trauma. He remained in the community and never fled. No known history of violence. Still, suspicion clung to him like hay on damp boots, and the whispers followed him for life. Children crossed the street when he walked by. Parents gave him side eyes at market. At church, people sat a little farther away. He eventually withdrew, became reclusive, spoke less and less. One of his final public statements, "I did what I thought was right. That is all." Cryptic, yes. Convincing, not especially. He died in 1941, buried in the same region where the murders occurred, not far from the site of Hinterkaifeck. And some say, on very cold nights, you can hear footsteps where the house once stood. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe someone's still looking for keys they never really lost. If there's one detail that haunts the case, more than even the murders themselves, it's this: someone lived on that farm after the family died. Not for an hour, not overnight, for days. Think about that. Someone walked among the bodies, stepped over the blood-soaked straw in the barn, and went back inside for a snack. They fed the cows, who probably didn't care as long as they got fed. They boiled water. They used the family's stove. They sat, possibly at Andreas's favorite table, eating his food with hands that had killed him. The house didn't go still after the murders. It went quiet, and the killer didn't run. They settled in. This part of the mystery is where things veer off the rails into what crime psychologists politely call behavioral anomalies. Most killers flee, especially if they've just killed 6 people in broad daylight. Even serial killers tend to get in, get out, and go find a parking garage to cry in. But this person, let's call them the guest, wasn't in a hurry. They may have even slept in the house, maybe in Victoria's bed, maybe on a pile of hay in the barn, just above where the bodies lay. We know they milked the cows. This wasn't just a keep-up appearances move. The animals were found fed, watered, and calm, no signs of stress or neglect. Whoever stayed at Hinterkaifeck had enough familiarity with livestock to do the job well, not just go through the motions competently, like a farmer, or someone raised on a farm. Investigators found that the animals had been tended with care. That's the word they used, care. As if the person responsible hadn't just committed an atrocity, but still felt some sense of responsibility to the creatures left behind, which is almost more unsettling than if they'd trashed the place and vanished. There's a running theory in criminal psychology that ritual behavior is a hallmark of serial killers. They return to the scene. They revisit their work. Sometimes they rearrange things. Sometimes they try to correct the narrative. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't even rage. This was a house being reordered by its own eraser. Here's your true historical fact. There's a German concept, Heimsuchung, that translates loosely to a haunting, but carries a connotation of being visited with misfortune, not randomly, purposefully. As if the house itself had drawn this violence into being. In old folk tales, Holmes, remember, a house where blood has been spilled becomes restless. That's why many old Bavarian families won't buy property where tragedy occurred. They say the ground turns sour, the air too thick. And that's why, after the farm was abandoned, no one wanted to live there, not just because of the crime, but because of what the place had become, a witness. Let's revisit some details. The kitchen was used after the murders. The bedclothes were adjusted. The clock was wound. Fresh food was consumed. Cows were milked. Smoke was seen from the chimney. The dog was fed. None of that aligns with any panic narrative. This wasn't someone running scared or improvising. This was routine, domestic, almost intimate. One theory suggests that the killer didn't just live on the farm afterward, but had been there before. Not for a day. Not for a week. For months. It's called the sleeping killer theory, and it's as chilling as it sounds. The idea is that someone, possibly a former farmhand, a squatter, or even an estranged family member, moved into the attic during the cold months. They listened, watched, waited, and on March 31st, they acted. Support for this theory comes from the early reports of noises in the attic. Footsteps when everyone was downstairs. Missing items like the key and the newspaper. A previous maid even quit because she was convinced the house was haunted. That's not a metaphor. She literally said, "This place is haunted." Nobody checked the attic thoroughly before the murders. Not even the police, at first. And even when it was eventually searched, weeks had passed. Plenty of time for someone to slip away. One quirky and genuinely unsettling detail. The attic had small peepholes between the boards. Some were natural knots in the wood. Others looked carved. Imagine someone lying on their stomach in the dust, peering down through cracks in the ceiling, watching the family eat, bathe, sleep, live. It's the stuff of horror movies. But it happened, or at least, there's enough circumstantial evidence to suggest it might have. What pushes this theory from weird to oh no is the idea that the killer began to see the house as theirs. That they didn't just want to destroy the Grubers, they wanted to replace them, live in their world, walk their routines, like the world's most horrifying identity theft. Philosophers who study evil, and yes, that's a thing, have proposed that some acts are not just about death. They're about control, about rearranging reality to match a distorted sense of order. In that sense, the killer at Hinterkaifeck wasn't simply erasing lives. They were editing a family. Some of the most respected profilers have said this theory, while disturbing, is actually more likely than a hit job, a robbery, or a random act of violence, because the killer left no message, no calling card, just actions, routine ones, quiet ones. Milking the cows, winding the clock, straightening the covers on the maid's bed. It's like the murders were the prelude, not the point. The point was what came after. And when you think of it that way, Hinterkaifeck stops being a crime scene and becomes something else entirely. A stage, a script written in silence, straw, and blood, and someone out there performed it perfectly. You might think that, by now, the story would be winding down. After all, what else is there to say about 6 people murdered with a farm tool, a killer who played house afterward, and a case that's twisted itself into more knots than a sailor's fever dream? But no, Hinterkaifeck wasn't finished. Because decades after the final hay bale was cleared, after the farmhouse was demolished and the woods swallowed its absence, theories still bloomed like wild mushrooms. Some fresh, some rotting, all bizarre, and some of them disturbingly plausible. Let's start with one of the most popular in recent years. Thanks to the internet's unrelenting appetite for cold cases and conspiracy, the doppelganger theory. It goes like this. Someone assumed the identity of one of the family members. Not after the murder. Before. Maybe they killed Andreas or Victoria and took their place. Maybe they lived among them undetected, playing the part so convincingly that even the rest of the family didn't realize something was off until it was too late. This sounds ridiculous until you remember that in the post-WWI chaos, documents were easily forged. People went missing all the time. Soldiers returned home so changed by war that families barely recognized them. And this theory finds its anchor in something very real. There were no recent photos of any of the victims, which means that if someone had, say, replaced one of them or infiltrated the house under the guise of a distant relative, no one would have the photographic evidence to say otherwise. Most of the villagers only saw the family in passing, from a distance, in church, at the market, and rural gossip loves a confident stranger with a good cover story. Still, let's admit it, this theory veers into creepypasta territory. More grounded, but no less chilling, is the conspiracy of silence theory, the idea that more than one person knew what happened, and they agreed, as a community, to let it go. It hinges on the fact that the village seemed to know something. When interviewed, some neighbors hesitated. Their timelines were fuzzy. Some contradicted each other. Others said they didn't want to get involved. One even claimed that a local pastor had once warned Victoria to leave the house before the spring. This theory is rooted in the cultural reality of small-town life. The preservation of order often comes before the pursuit of justice, especially in post-war Bavaria, where trauma was stitched into the land like frost lines. If someone in town did commit the murders, say, Lorenz or a jilted former worker, it's possible the rest of the village closed ranks. Better to carry a dark secret than attract attention to one's home, one's family, one's land. The land, after all, is what remains. Quirky historical side note. In 1920s rural Germany, land was identity. Losing your property meant losing your status, your income, even your voice in the village hierarchy. So if the truth threatened the land, well, maybe silence was the lesser evil. Another angle that's persisted involves the psychological decay of the family itself. Some have speculated the killer was one of the victims, possibly Andreas, who murdered his family, and then took his own life. But that's a stretch. His injuries were consistent with being struck in the head with a mattock. Not easy to do to oneself, unless you've got a mechanical arm and no gag reflex for pain. Still, this theory folds into a broader academic debate about familial implosion, the idea that certain family dynamics, left to rot in isolation, eventually eat themselves from the inside out. We know the Gruber-Gabriel family was not well. Incest, religious extremism, tensions over money, anger passed like inheritance. In another time, in another place, they might have had therapy.